So I go to my office because I explained to Parag earlier that I'm in the midst of changing houses, and there's no bedroom in the house that I currently own, so I have to live in a hotel for a few weeks. Um, so I go to the office because there's no place else for me to go to work, but there's nobody there. Almost nobody.
Parag is not joining us, but the rest of the labor people are here in the department. David, Simon, Josh. We're guarding the department against intruders.
Are classes meeting in person?
No, everything's online.
Yeah, me too.
Almost everything is online.
Okay, it's 2:35 on my clock, so welcome everybody. Let's get started. So I'm really excited to welcome Glenn Loury back to MIT Economics. Glenn got his PhD in 1976 from our department, where his thesis was supervised by Bob Solo and Peter Diamond. And he's had a really distinguished career, having taught at Northwestern and Michigan and Harvard, BU, and he's now at Brown, where he's the Merton Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences. Glenn has many professional gongs. One of the more recent ones was in 2016 when he was named a Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association. And in their description, they described him as a leading provocative public intellectual for 40 years, and emphasize that he is very broad-ranging, having written articles for outlets like Econometrica and the American Economic Review, but also in popular press outlets. And we were just joking before getting started. Many of us are actually quite avid followers of his podcast on Blogging Heads TV. So he was also an innovator on this dimension. His podcast dates back to 2007, and that's something that I regularly follow. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Glenn, and we'll do our usual talk for about an hour, take a break, and allow for questions. So welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Parag. I'm very glad to be here. Very, very glad indeed. It's an honor and a privilege, honestly. My old department, it takes me back. And actually, when I go back a long ways. I mean, the early 1970s. But enough about that. We're here to talk about racial inequality, the persistence of racial inequality. So you've looked at my it was intended to be provocative essay. I mean, first of all, it's provocative by where it's placed. It's in the City Journal of the Manhattan Institute, well known to be a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. So, already there's kind of between the lines or subtext, you're reading between the lines when you read an essay, because at least nowadays, you draw information from who a person is prepared to associate themselves with, as well as what it is that they have to say. But that's a side point. You have the essay. I just want to do a few things here. I'm not going to give a technical talk. This is more like a generalist kind of overview of some of the issues. It's going to be a little bit political, a little bit maybe moral philosophic, as well as social sciencey, and we'll see how it goes. But I have some ground that I want to cover. I have some provocations that I want to issue, and then I'll subside, and we can have some back and forth. I hope that you'll feel free to challenge me, and as a social scientist and as a social critic, and push me, as you might be inclined to do. Don't hesitate. Don't hold back. Don't think you'll offend me. I promise that I'm not going to, call anybody a racist if they take a position differently from the one that I'm advancing, or anything like that. Okay, so I have some.
Are you happy to have questions in situ, or do you want us to wait until the end?
Oh, I'd say clarifying questions are welcome. I think general, we're going to go on for a long time about this. Questions are probably best held to the end. I may not need to go an entire hour, maybe 45 minutes or so. We'll see. It takes as long as it takes, and then the break, and we can have the rest of the time for more extended Q&A. Okay, so the 4 Ps. This is my organizational principle here. We're talking about the problem of race. Race, I would use inverted commas. I'd want to be very careful with the word. I make some gesture toward this concern in the essay where I say, we want to define race carefully. What am I talking about? I want to be careful with the word. I think it's a dangerous word. I think it can be a loaded term. I think it sometimes is invoked gratuitously. There's a lot that could be said about how you want to frame, social discussions. I mean, for example, let me just be as provocative as I can possibly be right off the start. George Floyd, everybody knows who he was, killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota by a police officer, Derek Chauvin, in a famous incident that we've all seen. Was it a racial incident? I mean, Floyd is classified as African-American Black in the US context, and Chauvin is white. I mean, again, we might want to think about what we mean by these words. We throw them around very casually, but in any case, Chauvin is white, and Chauvin's knee was on Floyd's neck. Floyd's a Black man. Was that a racial incident? So what would we mean if we say it was a racial incident beyond the trivial statement that one of the participants was white and one was Black? Well, we might mean that we think we know the motive of Derek Chauvin when he put his knee on the man's neck, that he acted out of racial animus. So we might mean that the fact of Floyd being Black triggered certain connotations or reactions in the public. People identified with the incident in a particular way and interpreted it, narrated it, if you will, in a particular way because of the race of the participants, quite apart from the discriminatory intent of the people who were acting in that situation. There are a number of different things that we might mean about whether or not that was a racial incident, when the consequence of that incident is to engender national political trauma. And I think that's what you have to call what happened after the George Floyd killing. Cities were set partly ablaze. I mean, massive demonstrations in the street around the world, not only in the United States of America. I think the potency of the raciality, the raceness, the racedness of the situation becomes really quite clear. The point I want to emphasize here, though, is that that's independent. That's largely independent. The racial force of the incident is largely independent of causality. It's largely independent of intentionality. It has a lot to do with interpretation, a lot to do with narration, this kind of thing. I won't go on too long about that. I want to talk about race and racial inequality, and I have my 4 Ps. That's my organizing principle. Perennial, problem been around forever. This is America. The problem has been around forever. Personal, I'm Black. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. I care. These are my people at some level that we're talking about. Can I completely divorce that from the scientific imperatives? What's my responsibility? How am I going to be read? If I speak out in a particular register, with a particular outlook or tone of voice or content to the speech, it's going to be read in part in the context of my own racial identity. I mean, people are going to understand it to be a black economist, a Black professor, a Black intellectual, or whatever says this or that. I can't control that. That's the given. That's a part of the environment in which I'm trying to communicate. Personal because of my own life, but personal because of the fact that my Blackness, sadly, is it sad? Is it really unfortunate? My Blackness is a material element in the effect of what it is that I do. It conditions how it is that what I do is received. I'm not saying, again, I said I wasn't going to call anybody a racist. I'm not complaining here. I'm merely making an observation. Perennial issue, personal issue, political issue. The stakes are incredibly high in talking about race and racial inequality in the United States, as my reference earlier to civil disturbances after the killing of George Floyd suggests, as my observation that you had people marching for Black Lives Matter in cities all over the globe suggests, as this pending presidential ballot, which is in part enmeshed in this argument that's going on within American society about race, systemic racism, white supremacy, Black marginality, diversity and inclusion and equity and all of that, suggests very political and perplexing. I mean, because we do have a problem here. I mean, we have a social science problem. We have a challenge to the country kind of problem. We're 50 years past the civil rights movement. 50 years. Talking about 1970, 50 years. I mean, that's about as long, almost as long as from Appomattox where Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, and Versailles, where the Europeans sorted out the mess that was World War I. It's forever. It's a lifetime. Technology has completely changed in 50 years. Economy is completely different. Polity is completely different. Tens of millions of non-European immigrants have come to the country in the 50 years that I'm talking about. Everything is different. And yet, you know, you look at some of the speeches that are being given, you look at some of the events that are recorded for posterity in social media, some of the incidents that are taking place, the arguments that are being made, and it's as if we were still back in the 1970s somehow on some of these issues. Perplexing. Why? Black American disadvantage. So that's the agenda. Let me just say a little bit about my own biography. I'll be very brief. Everybody can read about me somewhere or another, but I grew up in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. I'm that old. Yeah, MIT 1976, it makes me shudder to even think about it. Most of these people that I'm looking at here weren't even born when I completed my studies at the great Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which was then, and I hope is still now, although I couldn't bet my life on it, the best department on the planet. It certainly was the best department on the planet in the early 1970s, with all those people running around doing all this fundamental stuff, so many Nobel Prizes to show for it and all that. But yeah, I came out of Chicago, out of the South Side of Chicago, out of a working class neighborhood. I'm Black. And I got to MIT, and I had two things in mind. I got a really good education at Northwestern University. This is an aside, but how about that Northwestern University? Because when I came back to Northwestern, I got a BA there. I went to MIT, finished in 76, came back to Northwestern as an assistant professor. And let me just see, Roger Meyerson was laboring over there in mathematical economics and decision sciences, as I recall. Bengt Holmstrom and Paul Milgram were about to arrive from Stanford as new assistant professors in Stanley Ryder's Math Center at Northwestern University. Dale Mortensen was laboring on his labor economics stuff and job market stuff as a applied economic theorist in the economics department. There were so many really, really brilliant economists. A lot of these people have been honored at the highest level for the achievements. That the whole profession looks different. I must say, I could go on for a long time about that, but that's not the point. I was just trying to tell you that I came to MIT in the early 70s. I got a good education at Northwestern. And I discovered a couple of things. One of them was I discovered the deep structure of analytical economics as best it could be rendered by this great department at that time, which, you know, was a world-changing intellectual experience. But I also discovered that economics is a social science. It's not, you know, divorced from policy, politics, society more generally. People like Paul Samuelson and Bob Solow and Peter Diamond and Franco Modigliani and many other people, Stanley Fisher, I think, Franklin Fisher, I think these are all my teachers. Maybe you never heard of these people. I'm sure you've heard of these people. Cared about the world. They cared about what was going on in the real world, as well as about impressing their peers with the virtuosity of their technical practice. And that kind of thing stuck with me. You can read about me. I went on, I taught at Harvard in the 1980s, taught at Boston University in the 1990s. I've been teaching at Brown here since 2005. I was a Black conservative public intellectual for a while, affiliated with the Reagan administration. I kind of recovered my senses to a certain degree and tacked back toward the center a little bit. But I think nowadays people would probably classify me as a conservative again, because I'm a kind of contrarian in many of the things that I have to say about the contemporary debates. Enough about me. You can tune into my podcast and see me hold forth on this or that issue. But it's a personal issue to me, and it has been throughout my life. And I guess I just flag one out of this personal, I say perennial, personal, political, and perplexing, my 4 Ps. And out of this personal, just one thing I would flag, which is this dilemma about scholarly practice. You know, you're an intellectual, what's your responsibility? Is truth the only thing that matters? Do you have to take care about how your scientific productivity might be exploited by other people and so forth and so on? And that's a conundrum. I don't have anything grand to say about it other than to identify the fact and maybe to signal my self-awareness of the fact that truth You know, it can be a slippery thing. Anyway, I want to talk. So that's my setup. Race in America, it's been around for a long time. It's a deep political question. It involves me personally. And there's something of a puzzle, persistence of racial inequality. So the essay makes an argument. And I want to preface the argument by invoking George Akerlof, an MIT alum, Robert Schiller, by invoking this notion of narrative, by at least gesturing at an appreciation for the power of the story, by noting that, you know, the actual historical evidence under-identifies, is that the right word? I'm not an econometrician, doesn't pin down the story that you're going to tell about the evidence. There are multiple stories. Yeah, I think that's right. There are multiple accounts that are consistent with the same facts. And so there's a kind of inescapable element of choice about how we're going to, quote, narrate, close quote, the facts. What's the story that we're going to tell about what's going on? And that's the world that I mean to invoke when I set this thing up in the essay about, you know, two conflicting narratives that you can tell about the persistence of racial inequality, the bias narrative and the development narrative. Now, I don't want to make this move without due consideration. I mean, I want to maybe just take a moment to try to defend the idea that I want to talk about narratives. Because a lot of people might say at this point, what do you mean narrative, smarative? I just want to know what the discrimination coefficient is. In other words, we did an audit study and we found the following difference in the mean rates at which employment was offered to the participants based upon blah, blah, blah. And have I got a clean estimate of the unobserved preference of the employer for hiring based upon race? That's what I want to know. Those are the facts. The bias narrative will be correct to the extent that there's bias. And we need to get busy measuring it. And alternatively, a person might argue that the supply side of the labor market is where all the action is. And then they might try to defend that principle. They might do a kind of Neil Johnson, you know, this is old school stuff. I don't know how many labor economists are still reading this paper from the 1990s, but it's an important paper where they take the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth and they've got measures at like 14 years old of the kids' quote unquote IQ, a cognitive test that the armed forces use to vet potential recruits. And they've got a measure of cognitive ability at teenage, and then they've got a longitudinal sample and they're looking at wages later in life, you know, young adult workers and their males, looking at the controlling basically only for the cognitive test. And they can explain the bulk of the difference in mean wages to Black and white young workers based upon just looking at the cognitive test. And the conclusion is it's a reduced form. They're going to say right away, we're not saying that the process by which the cognitive capacities are being generated are the same for the two different populations, but we are saying that once you have observed that early in life, you know a lot about what the life course in terms of wages is going to be for those people. So this is a development argument. This is an argument about the supply side of the labor market at some level. And a person might simply say, look, discrimination, you know, I don't know what you're talking about. We're, you know, try to assess discrimination here in this data set and we don't find it. So that would be one way of kind of poo-pooing my desire to talk about narratives by saying, basically, these are objective questions about cause and effect, and what we need are good models, good evidence, and good inference. And based on that, we'll be able to address these questions. And I don't think that's right. Let me give you one reason why I don't think that's right. What do I not think is right? I don't think it's right that it's just up to the facts and that a sufficiently robust inquiry based upon sufficiently granular evidence will resolve the question one way or the other. Let me give you an example about why I don't think it's just the evidence, why I want to talk about narratives. Then I'm going to go on and talk about the bias narrative and the development narrative, which is the opposition that I set up in this essay, which I hope you will critique if you think that it's off base, but that's what I'm going to get to. But hands up, don't shoot. Hands up, don't shoot. That was Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri, 2014. This is the origins of Black Lives Matter. This is a singular event in the history of the present moment with respect to racial relations and racial conflict in America, Michael Brown. And it looks pretty much like it wasn't hands up, don't shoot. It really looks like Brown probably attacked a police officer. Police officer probably was afraid for his life and he probably shot him. I don't want to pick a fight with anybody. 2 independent investigations, one by the local authorities and one by the US Justice Department, came to that conclusion about the killing, that Michael Brown didn't have his hands in the air. Eyewitnesses have testified to this effect. We could go into the details. I really don't want to pick a fight with anybody. If you feel like I'm misrepresenting the situation, of course you should say so. But my sense of the matter is hands up, don't shoot didn't happen. But it did happen virtually. It happened in effect. It happened poetically. It happened because the force of the narrative, Black man being brutalized by overbearing, brutal and racist state power, just overwhelmed all the facts in the case. I mean, for many people. There's a documentary film that's just recently been released, made by a filmmaker called Eli Steele, narrated by his father, Shelby Steele. It's called What Killed Michael Brown. I commend it to the attention of anybody who's really interested in these issues, because he offers this report about that incident. I won't go on very long about this, I won't. I'm just trying to make this point about narrative and about how the facts underdetermine the story and about how politics are driven by the story. That's the argument that I'm making at this point. Steele and company in this documentary review, the testimony and the evidence and whatnot in the Michael Brown case, and he comes to the conclusion that hands up, don't shoot he calls it a poetic truth. He says it is rather an account so powerfully resonant with the ruling narrative paradigm that it may as well be true. And once it gets out there, a lot of people are going to have a hard time being disabused of the fact that is true. Okay, that it's not true, if indeed it's not true. They'll have a hard time being disabused of that fact because the power of the narrative is so great for them. Anyway, I want to talk about the essay and I want to talk about these 2 narratives. Narratives are everything. I made that point. Structural racism is a kind of narrative. What do people mean when they say structural racism? I mean, I think I can give an account of that. I think they mean racially disparate outcomes produced by a complex system of social interaction that embodies historical practices which were, in retrospect, morally suspect, but which have taken on a life of their own and carry forward into the present day. And then we could give examples of that. Mass incarceration is structural racism because of the way that urban areas are organized, because of decisions that society has made about prohibiting trafficking in illegal substances, because of a lack of economic opportunity and a failure of educational opportunity for certain sectors of the society that leaves a lot of young people with a few alternatives for how they want to use their time rather than to engage in the black commerce, the dark commerce, the illicit commerce. Because the voting populace are disproportionately and irrationally fearful of Black crime and therefore are willing to reward politicians who promise to be punitive and harsh in a way in which they react to criminal offending. Because the people who are being held behind bars don't count for us as much, so that even after we've enacted something like 3 strike and you're out criminal punishments, which are excessive and not effective at deterring criminal behavior, we still don't walk it back and change our minds about it because the people who are suffering the consequences of that are Black. I think they mean something, people who use that phrase mean something like that. They don't mean there's a conspiracy of people in a room with pointy white hats on who are trying to figure out how to hurt Black people. They don't mean that. That's not what they're talking about. They're not talking about racism in the sense of what the General Social Survey measures when they ask this battery of questions of people about how do you feel about having neighbors of a different race? Suppose your child were to want to bring home a spouse of a different race. Would you accept that? Do you think Blacks are asking for too much? They ask a battery of opinion questions like this, and you can track the degree to which the respondents evidence what might seem in a common sense way to be racism over time. And you're going to see that graph go down. That's not the racism that they're talking about, I think. but I should let people speak for themselves about that because I'm not a big fan of that particular narrative. I can go into the reasons why. I think it's imprecise. I feel like people who invoke structural racism are really begging the question. I want to know exactly which structure. I want to know what dynamic processes, and I want to know how race figured into the story. And very often the people who are using that kind of language don't tell me that. But in any case, narratives. So I offer a juxtaposition. I say there's a bias narrative, and there is what I'm offering up, a development narrative. I'm offering the development narrative as a counterpoint to the bias narrative. And just to cut to the quick, I'm talking about the supply side of the labor market. I'm saying if we would just restrict attention to the labor market and we would just talk about wages, the bias narrative would be all about the demand side of the labor market. It would be about what do employers do? What kind of information do they have? What contracts are they willing to enter into on what terms with what kinds of workers? Does race affect that? Their bias? What are the training opportunities inside of organizations for people to move ahead? How, things of this kind. It's on the demand side. It's racism in the suites. We need anti-discrimination enforcement. That would be regulation coming in from the outside. And we need a change of hearts and minds on the inside. We need diversity and inclusion. We need diversity training. We need implicit bias training. That's all on the demand side. That's all the bias narrative. I juxtapose to that what I call the development narrative, and I frame it as provocatively, I imagine, as it could be framed. I mean, I'm basically saying, is there something about patterns of behavior within the population that is disadvantaged? I speak now about African Americans. We're talking about 35 or 40 million people here, okay? So we should be careful how we talk. There isn't gonna be one size fitting all. This is a very interesting, complex, variegated, differentiated, heterogeneous population. So one needs to bear that in mind. Nevertheless, I'm saying, are there patterns of behavior that are observable in certain communities of color, which have the consequence of inhibiting the development of the people in question of their human potential, such that the productivities that they offer are being more or less accurately rewarded by the market and are disparate in virtue of the fact that the level of development is disparate. Two narratives, the bias narrative and the development narrative. I give an illustration of why the distinction might be important in these narratives. It's a small scale issue, but I think it does sharply exhibit the distinction that I'm trying to draw. And that's about school discipline. I contrast the Department of Education policy under the Obama administration of admonishing school districts that reported racial disparity in the frequency with which students were suspended from school for disruptive behavior by race. So these statistics are collected. You can look at the average frequency of suspension for Black and white students in a school district, and you can see a disparate incidence of suspension by race. And the Obama administration Secretary of Education, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, sent a letter around to local school districts warning them that they should be aware of and take efforts to reduce this disparity, else they might find themselves subject of civil rights investigation for racial discrimination, and in this case, the administration of school discipline. Now, there is a disparity. I don't have the numbers here. I'm not giving that kind of talk. They would be easy to find. And it's non-trivial. And if indeed it were a reflection of the differential behavior of the school district's principals, teachers, and security officers and whatnot, and how they treated disruptive behavior such that the same behavior by a student who was white would be met with a softer and less punitive response, that would be a deeply alarming thing about public education. It is something that should occasion the attention of the authorities to try to do something about it. So that's one possibility. If, on the other hand, there actually were differences in the frequency with which disruptive behavior were exhibited by students by race for reasons that we could spend a long time talking about. But as a matter of fact, objectively, there really were racial differences on the, as it were, supply side of the offending here, disrupting the class, causing the administrators to deal with you by removing you from the student body for a period of time. If in fact there were racial differences in that, I have to bracket here the possibility that teachers, implicit bias, interpret the behavior patterns that exhibited by Black students in a more threatening way for reasons of their own racial bias or consciousness. This is certainly possible. I have to bracket all of that and just put this stark opposition to you. Either they are discriminating against the students who are Black by treating them more harshly, or there is a higher frequency of disruptive behavior amongst the Black students for reasons that lie outside the school itself. If in fact that's the case, if the problem is on the supply side of the market, I argue, then interpreting the fact of disparate suspension rates as evidence of racism and responding to that fact by disciplining the school districts, cutting off their funding, perhaps hauling them into court or whatever, would be a horrible mistake. It would be exactly the wrong thing to do. Rather, one would want to address one's attention to the sources of the behavioral differences between the students by race. The response wouldn't be laissez-faire, it wouldn't be indifference. One would not dismiss the disparity, but one would respond to the disparity, wouldn't one, by attempting to enhance the opportunities or the experiences of the young people which shape their behavior patterns so as to be less disruptive. I mean, there are other possibilities. One might become more tolerant of disruption because a punitive reaction to disruption across the board would be predictably to generate a racial disparity, which racial disparity is in itself a bad thing. And therefore, perhaps we should tolerate a little bit more disruptive behavior. I mean, there are many, you can go many places with this thing, but I'm using it to illustrate the difference between these two narratives as applied in that particular fact situation, the bias narrative and the development narrative. So I'm willing to talk about the development problem. I'm willing, some people are going to say, to blame the victim. I'm willing to invoke the demographic observation of a high rate of single parenthood in African-American families, mother alone raising kids. 3 in 4 kids is 70%, something like that, born to a Black woman in America today are born to a woman without a husband. Does that have any implication? Does that circumstance, I mean, this is a sociological question. It's a fair question. There are people on both sides of it. Have any developmental implication for the patterns of behavior, for the acquisition of cognitive skills, for the discipline, the self-discipline of sensitive adolescence or whatever, for the susceptibility to engage in criminal behavior, for school failure, for early unwed pregnancy? Does it have any implication? Okay, common sense suggests to me that it can't be unrelated to some of these outcomes. Suggests to me that it's an important, not the only, perhaps not the main, but it would be an important part of the picture that one would want to take on board if one were going to talk about persistent racial inequality. Now, the fact that I'm willing to take it on board doesn't answer the question of, what's the causal mechanism? I mean, easily one could argue, it seems to me, a historical sociologist, a historian, a demographer might argue that, you have these different organizational patterns within families, but they are explicable in terms of the historical experience of the respective groups. They are, one might argue, in line with someone like Orlando Patterson, the sociologist at Harvard, a consequence of the natal alienation, that's natal, N-A-T-A-L, alienation, attendant to slavery. The fact that families were disrupted at their core by the intercession of the master's property claim over and against the filial and familial connections and of natal bonding that are the natural circumstance of human development. And that it's impossible that you could have had as intrusive a institution of intervention into intimate social relations amongst the African descended people, as was slavery, and not have there be some present day consequence of that. Of course, that is one hypothesis. I think you would certainly have to take it seriously. A person might argue that labor market conditions, that if it had been the post-war boom of the 1940s or the boom of the 1960s with tight labor markets, you get one kind of family dynamic. And if it's a slump where, various kinds of economic decentralization and offshore competition and technical change and whatnot, displacing workers and decline of unions and the relative paucity of good paying jobs for modestly skilled people would have knock-on consequences in terms of social organization, of which this family composition issue that I'm raising could be one. You could argue about that. Nothing that I would have said if I say development, human development. Human development takes place largely inside families. Family organization matters. There's big racial disparity in family organization. Therefore, a part of the story that you need to tell to account for persisting racial inequality needs to run through this particular pathway of family organization. In saying that, I would not have precluded a complex and subtle historical argument about the sources of the family organizational patterns that I've implicated. I would simply have been willing to consider the supply side as well as the demand side in trying to think about persistent racial inequality. And I am willing to consider it, and indeed I'm urging that we consider it. Violence, murder, homicide, huge racial disparities in the incidents. Everybody can read the newspaper. I don't need to recite cases. I don't need to name the names of the 6-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and 12-year-olds who've been killed, sitting on their mother's lap, sitting on the porch, standing at the bus stop, walking away from school by the stray bullets fired by armed men who are in conflict with each other over whatever they're in conflict with each other about. That is a reality. It's a reality of the contemporary urban scene. And it has a huge racial disparity. This guy, I'm sorry, there's a sociologist at Yale, Chris something or another, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name now, who's done this kind of ecological spatial analysis of, he's taken data in Chicago and he's looked at, who belongs to what gang, where they are, and he's got the killings of that have happened, and he's kind of can see, he can map out the extent to which the killings are generated by conflicts between particular criminal organizations that he can identify and whatnot. And it's a very, it's a very tightly networked set of social connections amongst the people who are committing and are victimized by a lot of the criminal violence. There's a story, an interesting story, I think, that's being told there in terms of the kind of social anthropology of violence in American cities. But is that bias? Is that phenomenon, the phenomenon I just got through calling attention to, in any straightforward, easily identifiable way, a manifestation of bias, of racism? Is it about white supremacy? Or is it about socialization or the failure to socialize some part of a population to a kind of self-disciplined civil behavior that makes ordinary life, commerce, and so forth possible for the people with whom they are cohabitating, with whom they are in juxtaposition one to another in these enclaves. A willingness to ask about the behavior of the violent criminals preying on their neighbors would be a part of taking seriously my invocation of the development narrative. I again want to repeat, I'm not counseling laissez-faire. I am not saying back off and don't try to do anything. There's nothing to see here. Policy can't go anywhere because it's all on the development side. Policy obviously has a lot to do with the development side. From education, preschool education, child development, parenting skills, I mean, we could talk for a long time about that. But I am urging, I guess, a willingness to take seriously the patterns of behavior and their cultural antecedents. Okay, now we also get controversial culture, belief, patterns of belief, values, cultivated habits, expectations, whose opinion of me do I actually value? What do I think? Who am I? What's my identity? What are my, who's like me? Who are my heroes? What do I want to emulate? What constitutes a good life? These things may also come to differ by race. People talk about the academic achievement gap. They talk about the, well, Harvard University, as you all know, has been sued in court by Asian Americans who are questioning the affirmative action practices at Harvard and saying that they're being disadvantaged by them. As you all know, the exam schools in New York City, I'm talking about the Bronx High School of Science, Stuyvesant, this kind of thing, are under pressure to change their selection criteria so as to ensure that they don't enroll a class of over 1,000 first-year students and have there be only 7 or 8 or 10 Black students in the class. Okay. This kind of thing, as you know, if you were to look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, this is a nationally representative sample of American students who were tested for their cognitive abilities in mathematics and writing. I think at, I don't know, the 4th, 7th, 11th, I can't remember the grades, but they're tested early, they're tested at 8th grade, and they're tested at 11th grade, something like that. And you could get a kind of report card on educational achievement of American students. And there are huge racial disparities in those data. I actually talk a little bit about that or call attention to it somewhere or another in this essay. Now, am I willing to consider the supply side when I talk about that? Am I willing to ask what's going on in the homes? Am I willing to ask, what do peer groups value? Am I willing to measure how much time are people spending on homework? When do they turn off the television? How many books are there? Am I willing to wonder about whether or not the parent invested in reading to the kid when the kid was 3 years old or 5 years old so as to facilitate their acquisition of language facility? Is the disparity by race and academic achievement, which is gargantuan, better understood through the narrative of the bias narrative or the development narrative? I leave that as a question. Can you see, I ask, what's at stake? Do you see why it is that I even bother to put such a question? It matters hugely, I want to argue, how we think about this kind of thing. So,
one question, Glenn.
Sorry, that's Darren?
Yeah. I mean, the two could be, they may not be distinct, that the bias may be working precisely through some of the things that you have pointed out. I mean, when you take a minority that starts out politically voiceless and economically disadvantaged, the way that their internal organization and how they fit into society does not get constructed without reference to the social roles and other things that the powerful majority imposes on them.
Okay, they're not mutually exclusive. Yes, I'm pretty sure I have a line in there somewhere in the essay where I say these things aren't mutually exclusive. I talk about developmental processes being contextualized socially and politically, and about how you could have bias in the delivery of educational services or whatever. And I also talk about how the bias narrative itself might need to work through informal social organization as much as it through explicit market discrimination and whatnot. But I'm not sure I'm responding to you.
No, I think you've presented the two as sort of diametrically opposed, but exactly just what you said. The two may be intimately related, and then the question will be, which are the interventions that work, which can be asked without, negating one side or the other.
Okay,
affirmative action may work even if it's not just bias.
Fair enough. And let me just say that I'm pushing against the overwhelming tide in simply being willing to raise the development side of the question. I don't want it to be overlooked, but I don't mean to have a totalistic account in which I'm saying that's the only thing that's going on. And you may be right And certainly I have to realize that we're speaking to a global community here, not just in the United States, and these issues arise in many contexts. You want me to be right that some of the most interesting questions have to do with how those things interact one with another. So yeah, I think we're on the same page on that. Are there other questions or comments? Because I'm gonna push ahead here. You have the essay. I'm not going to try to recapitulate the essay, but I did want to underscore this contrast between narratives, and I wanted you to see what I'm after. Blaming the victim. People will accuse me of that. They will say, if you're prepared to discuss the supply side, if you're prepared to talk at all about the extent to which a disadvantaged group and a oppressed or discriminated or marginalized group are themselves to some degree implicated in their own disadvantage, then you're blaming the victim. And I want to reject that. I think that's just a mistake. I don't think any blame has been assigned in making an observation that there is a supply side to the labor market, and making the observation that people are making choices and engaging in behaviors that have deleterious consequences for their future prospects. That doesn't necessarily blame anybody for reasons such as were just being hinted at. Those patterns of behavior that you call attention to, well, might be the consequence of structural conditions and historical dynamic. On the other hand, I would say, if the reflexive response to seeing any disparity of behavior is to say, well, it's only a consequence of historical exigency, of course, people's families are differently organized. What would you expect but for the weight of history? Then that has its own moral philosophic implications. I'm talking now about agency and about the extent to which people can control their fate and the extent to which their norms, their communal norms and patterns of living are within their ability to shape and control them. Is it a necessity that the homicide rate be what it is in many of these communities that we're concerned about here in the United States when we talk about racial inequality? Is that really how one wants to talk about such matters, to say, oh, what can we do? Of course, there's a high level of violence. Look at our structure, look at our gun laws, look at our hypocrisy about narcotic consumption and trafficking. Look at the history of racism in this country. Of course, there's going to be a high level of violence. I think such a posture is repulsive, frankly. Again, I invite argument. I think it's repulsive morally to impute to people no agency and to simply observe about them, even in their most wretched condition, even the worst of the worst, to say of it, oh, well, what could we expect? I mean, not only does it infantilize the subjects of such a discourse, they become merely baubles. They become puppets at the end of a string being pulled this way or that by forces outside of themselves. Not only that, but it removes the possibility of social judgment. It undermines the capacity to clearly delineate lines between right and wrong ways of living and to affirm right ways of living. If indeed we all, no matter what our pathology, are to be understood as, this is Kant. This goes all the way. I'm not a philosopher. Everybody knows I'm not a philosopher, but I read the Grundrisse Foundation for Metaphysics of Morals. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what Brother Immanuel Kant was talking about. And as I understand the argument, this is the principled argument for the capacity for a theory of morals. He asserts, while it is certainly true that we are all embedded within the flux and the flow of history, and under the influence of forces, environmental, psychological, and such, beyond our control, nevertheless, the theorist must assume the capacity of individuals to make free will choices about their moral life, lest there be no possibility for any theory of morals whatsoever. This is Kant. I'm going to sign on to that argument here now, talking about the necessity for engaging the development narrative alongside talk about bias, the necessity for calling attention to patterns internal to a community of behavior and value which may inhibit their success, and defending myself against the accusation that I'm giving aid and comfort to racists, or that I am somehow blaming the victim for their plight when I do so. That would be the argument that I would try to advance to defend myself in that context. Okay, so those are the narratives. I'm making a case for the development narrative to get some space. I'm making the case for the development narrative to get some space within our larger discourse about these issues. Cautiously, I'm making that case. Not unmindful of pitfalls, not unmindful of danger. Okay, what will the racists say? I can hear the retort. If you talk like that, whatever the merits of such talk, don't you know that in a complex society like the one that we live in, where there are many people much less sympathetic to the well-being and aspirations of the disadvantaged than are you, Professor Loury, who would hear you, and especially you being a Black man, talking in that way, and take that as license to entertain their own scurrilous, racist thoughts about why racial inequality persists. And I meant to suggest my concern about this kind of a matter right at the beginning when I say, what are the responsibilities of an intellectual, when I understood this to be a personal as well as a political, perennial political problem for the country. And when I asked, I asked the rhetorical question of what are my role and responsibilities in the midst of such a situation, given that I know that people are going to take things that I say partly as an indication of, well, here's a Black guy who's saying that, and he therefore gives license to others. I'm mindful of that, but and I can't prove this scientifically, I cannot, but I'm going to make the declaration that as between an effort to manage political discourse by selectively withholding arguments I believe to be true, but that I think might not be helpful to a particular cause, as between that on the one hand, or giving voice to such insight as I think that I might have, subject to repudiation and refutation by other critics, so as to enliven and enrich the political and public discourse about these vital matters on the other, I choose the latter path. I'm willing to take the risk. And one of the reasons I allude to this in the essay and some of the more polemical meanderings that I engage in further back in the essay, I say, one of the reasons to be honest about what's going on the development side of the equation is that everybody can see it. I say people are bluffing when they say, oh, I'm not going to talk about the Black family. Out-of-wedlock birth rates don't matter. People are bluffing when they say, well, we're Black Lives Matter and we're about cops killing kids. And that's bad. That's state violence and that's bad. And we're against that and we're going to protest. And we don't have anything to say about kids killing kids because we're for Black Lives Matter. But when we say Black Lives Matter, what we mean is this particular thing. I understand the rhetorical sleight of hand that's at play. But what I'm saying is that there are a lot of people who are looking at the objective facts just as you and I are looking at them and are coming to very different conclusions. And they withhold saying so because it's impolite, it's politically incorrect. It seems to be a sign of moral ineptitude or moral turpitude, I almost want to say, to even be willing to raise such arguments. That is, people in their ordinary lives, around the coffee machine at work, around the kitchen table or whatever. But in fact, people can actually see what's going on. I think I should actually wait for Q&A before I expand. I don't want to lose my train of thought. I'm trying to make the case for the being willing to take seriously the development narrative. And I'm saying one of the things in favor of doing so is that a lot of people can see the development problems as they exist and manifest themselves. They don't attribute everything that they see to bias, even if polite company makes it such that they're supposed to pretend that they do.
Glenn?
Yes.
Sorry, maybe you want to defer this to the Q&A. This is Amy. I was just trying to think about in the case for the development narrative, what do you think are the underlying causes of those the within differences, as you put them? If it's not policy, but it's something innate in people, where are those in turn sort of, where do they come from?
Why is it that 3 and 4 kids born to a Black woman are born to a woman without a husband?
Sure.
Is that what you're asking me? In effect, that's
yeah.
the thing. Gosh, I mean, short answer is I haven't got a clue. I mean, that wouldn't be quite accurate. I could tick off things that people say. There would be the economic, I mean, you know these things.
No. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to think about what kinds, I'm not asking you to actually answer the question, but say what are the list of things that are potential inputs into the development narrative that aren't, that you think are sort of separate from the bias narrative, right? If you say, oh, it's economic conditions, then we can argue about whether economic conditions are in turn like generated by the development narrative or the bias narrative. So I guess the underlying primitives that are like the bias narrative, has a pretty clear story of what the underlying primitives are, I think. So,
yeah, that's anti-Black racism, I guess is what you'd say.
Yes, and
I guess what you're going to have to say here is the economy. You're going to have to invoke William Julius Wilson and such, and you're going to have to talk about structural changes in American social economic organization over the course of the 20th century. I guess you're going to have to talk about it's a kind of thing that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, the writer, others have given voice to. Nicole Hannah-Jones has also given, the period of redlining and segregation.
Sorry, I think I'm being totally unclear. So let me.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. Let me try one more time, and then I can also just maybe someone else can help me, or I can step back and try to think about what I'm saying. Imagine a world that we were viewing, like there are two races, black and white. I imagine the bias narrative is saying for some reason, for some flip of a coin in the US, at least one race, got power over the other. And then bias, they decided to, invoke biased actions, whether slavery or economic policy like redlining, etc. And the development narrative, we have two races that, black and white. There's no what caused one of them to end up in a different socioeconomic environment than the other if there wasn't that type of bias policy, or at least that maybe I'm not understanding the two narratives correctly, but that's what I was trying to think about when I read your article and I'm listening to you now.
Okay, Amy, let me try to respond one more time. I think you do understand the difference between these narratives, and I want to say something like the following. So here would be a stick figured, very simplistic model. So we got people, they belong to races. We're not going to go deep on what we mean by that. We're just going to take that as a given. There are processes of development into which, so there's a production function, and into which there are purchased inputs, so people have quality of schooling and you can spend more or less on that. And then there are inputs that are not fungible, that they are not commodities transacted between people, like the amount of time a mother spends reading to her young child. That is internal to the nature of the relationship between the mother and the child. There are things like, I belong to a peer group, I have friends, and then there's social externalities, there's spillovers. Things that I want to accomplish tend to be, to some degree, the things that the peer group that I associate myself with want to accomplish. And so there are these external effects.
Okay.
So the production of a worker of a particular quality or productivity depends upon these purchased inputs, and depends also upon these socially provided inputs that are not transacted in markets, but rather are the indirect consequence of social connectivity or affiliation. So now in a world like that, if I have a consciousness of a cognizance of race, if people partly define themselves in terms of racial identity, and then affiliate with each other in networks of social affiliation, these could be residential communities, these could be family organizations, these could be other kinds of associations between people, within which networks some of these social spillovers that promote development take place, then I can get disparate developmental patterns between the two populations, notwithstanding the fact that nobody's discriminating in a transaction, because people are, quote, discriminating, close quote, in their affiliation within these networks, and the networks are the medium through which is transmitted these social influences. And
thank you. That was super helpful. Sorry, it took me a couple attempts to figure out what I was trying to ask, but that was very, very helpful. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. Your question is helpful because it gave me a chance to prove to you that I'm actually an economist thinking about behavior within a context of interaction. That's what we do, isn't it? That's the name of the game, right? that I've actually thought this through. You know, you can pull down my dissertation. It's still over there somewhere in Dewey Library or somewhere. Do you all still have Dewey Library?
We do have Dewey
everybody is
Library.
muted. Everybody
Not
is muted.
during COVID.
We do have it, and your dissertation is online.
Okay, it's online. Anyway, yes, thank you, Amy, for the question. That's the kind of thing that I have in mind. I say discrimination in contract, that's bias. Discrimination in contract, I'm an employer, I'm a landlord, I'm a banker, whatever, and I'm doing a transaction with you. We've got a contract. I can see your race. I set the terms differently based upon what I see. That's bias. And I say discrimination in contact. Contract, contact. I'm being clever playing with words. Contact, association, affiliation, identity, connectivity, family, community, peer. I'm one of you, this kind of thing. And I say about that, whereas anti-bias laws can, to some extent, regulate contractual interactions. You can fine and punish and take into court people who discriminate in employment and so forth. Our very commitment to autonomy of the individual and freedom of association limits the extent to which a government through public policy could regulate the contact patterns and network association patterns that are characteristic of a society. But as long as race is a meaningful part of people's identity in a society, and they reproduce those meanings through their patterns of association over time, you're going to get disparity to some degree in the structure of the networks in which people are embedded. And when network mediated spillovers in human capital development are important, you're going to get persisting racial disparity. This is the core of the argument that I try to make, that I've been developing since I wrote that dissertation back in 1976. So I appreciate the question.
I think we should take a 5-minute break at this point, and then we're going to ask you a lot more questions.
Okay, well, if you insist, because I wanted to talk about affirmative action and reparations, but that could take a long time.
No. Well, let's do that. So let's give people a 5-minute break, and then take as much time as you want to talk about that, and then we'll ask you more questions.
Okay, so here's I mean, everybody knows I was in I left MIT in 76. I think Sandy Darity left in 77 or 78. William A. Darity, professor, Duke University. And he's the other black guy. No, he's not. There's more than two of us. There's more than two of us. But he's a black economist, and he's a very prominent man. He's got a book out about reparations, and it's a big issue. And I'm against it. Okay, and I want to just give some flavor of what it is that I'm concerned about, and it does reveal something about my larger outlook, which doesn't have to be right, but it's the one that I embrace. I'm against it for a couple of reasons. One of them is, okay, when the Japanese Americans who were interned by the Roosevelt administration during the Second World War were finally, in an act of Congress signed into law by Ronald Reagan, acknowledged as having been wrongly victimized and offered a token reparation payment. It was $20,000 a head for 80,000 people. Okay, that's $1.6 billion, and it was paid out of the US Treasury, and it should have been paid. I have no problem with that whatsoever. There are 35 or 40 million African Americans, and if you take 40 acres and a mule and you bring it forward at a normal rate of return, I don't know, we're in the many tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe we're $100,000 a head, okay? That's $4 trillion. That's 40 million people, and that's $4 trillion compared to 80,000 people and $1.6 billion. Here's what I'm saying. You would be creating a social security magnitude fiscal social policy in America based upon racial identity. That's a mistake for the society. That's South Africa-esque. You have to classify people, and you have to enact statutes and laws and administrative practices based upon people's race. We ought not to go down that path. That's just my opinion. People are going to differ with that opinion, but that's the moral argument that I would make. I also have a practical argument, which is that African Americans do have problems, our communities. We could enumerate them. I've already hinted at that. They're going to be around for a while. They're not going to go away overnight, and they appropriately deserve a sympathetic engagement by the polity as a whole. This is an open-ended commitment. This is the consequence of America's bitter history of slavery and Jim Crow segregation and whatnot. it would really not be the smartest thing in the world to cash that out. You know, to basically have a transaction where Black people sit on one side of the table with our moral capital, and America is on the other side of the table, and a transaction is in effect negotiated in which the debt is discharged. You owe me, you've been paid. You owe me, you've been paid. You don't want to commodify that. Rather, I would argue, and people will argue against this, what you want to do is take your chips and put them with the larger progressive political initiatives to create a decent society for everybody. I'm talking about healthcare. I'm talking about housing. I'm talking about food security. I'm talking about employment. I'm talking about preschool education. I'm talking about old age security. I'm talking about the welfare state. Where it's sufficiently robust on behalf of everybody, most of the concerns that you have about the racial disparity would be ameliorated. And you would have lent your moral capital to the right cause, not a racially defined reparation, we're going to balance the scales, but rather a humanistically defined improvement in the quality of the social contract broadly understood. That's my speech. Not everybody's going to buy it. Now, I want to say just one final thing about affirmative action. Because it's, you know, we're, as I say, 50 years down the line, we've been talking about this forever. And it's institutionalized. Diversity and inclusion and equity, that means affirmative action. I have a concern, and let me just voice it, which is that equality of representation when you are in the most rarefied venues of selection is in competition with equality of respect. I'm talking about the right tail. I'm not talking about selecting at the median of the population. I'm talking about selecting at the 95th percentile of the population, which is what you do when at Brown University, we get over 30,000 applications for 1,500 or 1,600 seats. So we're way out in the right tail of whatever assessment measures that we're exploring, employing, I should say, when we make selections to undergraduate admissions. Now, you're selecting at the right tail. It can't be that there are not going to be post-admissions difference in the performance of students selected if you use different criteria pre-admission to select them, as long as the criteria that you're using are actually correlated with the post-admissions performance. If the criteria, SAT test scores, grades in previous educational thing, advanced placement tests, quality of the essay written, whatever indicia of performance you want to use, are not correlated with post-admissions performance, they shouldn't be being used to the extent that they have a disparate impact on a historically disadvantaged group. You shouldn't use those if they're not correlated. They either are or they are not. If they're not, you shouldn't be using them. You're using them. Because we all know that they are correlated with post-admissions performance to some degree. The context, if it's graduate education and we're talking about the GREQ is one thing. If it's undergraduate education and we're talking about the SAT verbal, it's another thing. It's not going to be the same thing everywhere, but they are correlated. So they're correlated. Now you use different cutoffs. I invite you to look at the data produced by Discovery in the Harvard case, for example, to see the huge disparity in indices of academic preparation characteristic of applicant populations by race to Harvard University. That's just one window on this reality. It's somewhat opaque because institutions are not forthcoming with their data. We have different criteria of selection. There's going to be different post-selection performance if the criteria are correlating with performance. These are large samples. That's inescapable. Now, what's the consequence of that? I'm in the right tail. Remember, I'm in the right tail. I'm selecting elites. What's the consequence of that? The consequence of that is either we acknowledge the difference in post-admissions performance, or we don't, or we cover it up. We flatten the assessment criteria. We pretend that it's not there. The dishonesty can be stifling. So I'm an economics department. Let me talk in terms of people can understand. I'm talking about affirmative action. And I'm about to conclude. I'm making a claim. Right tail selection plus racially preferential selection is inconsistent with true equality. It'll get you representation, but it won't get you equality. You can see roughly what I mean by equality is equality of respect. You need something, a closely approximating parity of performance to get equality of respect. But you've selected with different different levels of selectivity into an activity which is highly competitive and elite, where the selection criteria are correlated with post-admissions performance. So you're getting disparities in performance post-admission that you're not owning up to, or that you're covering up in one way or another. So economics, there are not enough Black economists. I agree. We should be diverse and inclusive. I agree. Of the 20 top 10 departments in the country, there should be 2 at every one of them. I agree. There's not. We got to do better. Now, maybe I can agree with all of that. But if the way you're going to do better is to make criteria of selection into this rarefied enterprise of academic economics at the frontier, at the top, dependent upon racial identity, you're not going to get equality. You're going to get Black mediocrity to some degree. You know, this is like unspeakable. It's unspeakable to say that there could be racial differences in performance, but I get letters in my inbox all the time. I'm a partner at a big end law firm in New York City. Here's what I can't say publicly, please don't quote me. Many of our associates who are of color are not up to snuff, but we hired them because we, you know, et cetera. And some of them are going to make partner, and I shudder at that prospect. I've heard people say that. Now, here's what you ought to do instead. You ought to devote your effort to enhancing the development of African-American prospects, such that when you apply roughly equal criteria of selection at the right tail, the numbers whom you end up selecting increase. They do not have to increase the population per parity. That is a huge mistake. We don't have population parity in every pursuit. You know, these numbers have to add up to 1. How can you expect population parity in an enterprise where some groups are overrepresented by a factor of 2 or 3 relative to their population? I don't have to name the groups, we all know who they are. You can't get population parity with equal criteria selection when all the populations are not feeding in at the same rate in every activity. That's a mistake. So the permanent embrace of preferential selection in extremely selective competitive venues by race is a mistake. I can understand its transitional use, historically speaking, but its institutionalization is inconsistent with true equality. So would go Glenn Loury's argument. Thank you for your attentions. I'm open for colloquy.
Thanks, Glenn. I think we're going to have a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back with a lot of questions. I mean, Glenn, I saw your thesis advisor on Friday.
Oh, you did? Robert Sola?
Yeah, I went out and interviewed him.
Wow.
We did it outdoors.
How's he doing? How's he holding up?
He's amazing. He's just so
Oh,
amazing.
I didn't realize you did that in person, David. That was in person.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
Bob,
wow. Okay.
Bob could not do it remotely. He said, I don't know how to use Zoom. I've never done that. I can barely hear you. I need you physically present. And the CEO of Brookhaven, which is the residence he lived in, said, okay, if you guys do this outside, we'll allow it. And so, and you know, we sat like 12 feet apart. We had a camera crew. It was actually funny. Bob comes out and he comes over to like shake my hand. I'm like, Bob, stop. No. But he spoke in paragraphs, soliloquies, and essays on the questions we asked him about. It was amazing. We're editing the video and we'll have transcripts of it. So it'll appear on the Work of the Future. He's on the advisory board of the Worker of the Future Task Force, which I co-lead. And so we wanted to ask him his opinion about, what are the threats? What are the causes? What's he worried about? What do we do about it? And it was amazing. So he's just, God, I wish I could be that articulate at, 55 he is at 95.
And he's in his 90s for sure, right?
96.
Wow. Well, God bless him.
Yeah. I'm sure he remembers you well. I should have asked him, actually. I should have mentioned you were coming this week.
It's no big deal. But I get you about the clarity of the mind, and I'm so happy to know that it's still there, because I can remember some of these lectures that he would give, and price theory and growth theory and whatnot. And it's one thing to be able to get the I's dotted and the T's crossed. It's another thing to convert the basic vision about the technical work into a narrative that anybody with a decent education can understand what you're talking about and get a pretty good sense of how things are going. And he was very gifted at that, I thought.
Yeah. Well, he famously ripped up his lecture notes at the end of every semester, at the end of every year, because he didn't want to get stale.
Let me just say that I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, me either. I famously check my punctuation in my lecture notes and set them aside for the following year.
Last year's notes come in very handy when you're trying to make this year's lecture. I found.
Did you read the recent book Cast by
Isabel Wilkerson? I haven't gotten to it yet. I
don't think you'll be a fan based on what you're saying. I didn't love it myself at all.
I see. Yeah, it's been brought to my attention, but and I didn't expect to be a fan, but you know,
yeah.
It's what makes the world go round.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's it's extremely well written, and I think you could make the point in the book in about 25 pages. But I mean, I guess that's true of a lot of books.
So this is when we would be sipping coffee and munching on cookies if we were in face-to-face.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll start again in just a minute. If anyone, if you guys have questions that are raise your hands, because otherwise, I know that I know that Jerome and Prague and Simon and I will start asking questions, and we should defer to you. All right, I think we should get this conversation started again. So Emma Rackstraw, go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, Dr. Loury. First of all, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
I read and really loved your 2002 book.
Oh.
And there's a particular paragraph in this book that I feel I'm wondering sort of how you square the version of your argument that you're putting forth in this article with this particular paragraph.
Okay.
So what I'm interested in is what you call axiom 2, which is anti-essentialism. And you say the enduring and pronounced social disadvantage of African Americans is not the result of any purportedly unequal innate human capacities of the races. Rather, this disparity is a social artifact, a product of the peculiar history, culture, and political economy of American society. And I think I take axiom 2 very seriously, and I loved seeing it written out that way. I see very few social scientists putting it forth in that manner. And so when I think I can sort of get on board with your entire framework and argument sort of up to the point where you say, developmental bias is sort of the remaining bias we need to, or developmental disparities are sort of what we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on these behavioral disparities. And I think if you take the anti-essentialist axiom seriously, for me, it sort of pushes me to dig further into the source of that behavioral disparity. So it's not just that there are differences in marriage rates for Black versus white women. It's that there must be some kind of historical discrimination or stigma story or stereotype threat and differences in expectation story that can explain what's going on with that behavioral disparity. And so the policy implications from, I think, what's written in the article are we need to focus on two-parent family formation in Black communities. Whereas the policy implication, which I think is sort of a normative argument. Whereas the policy implication that I take away is we need to figure out what the source of these disparities are. Is it the demographic mismatches from missing African-American men who are incarcerated or dead? Is it, these sort of like economic reasons that you referred to earlier? So I'm just wondering, is that how you would sort of carry through the anti-essentialist axiom through the argument that you are making in this article?
Okay, Emma, thank you. I really appreciate the question. I really, really appreciate it. You put your finger on something important, potentially a contradiction or inconsistency in an argument. And one wants not to have any inconsistencies in one's argument. So let me see if I can address it. I want to call your attention to my podcast because recently I had a debate with Adaner Usmani. He's a sociologist at Harvard. You saw it. You know what I'm talking about. Okay, and he's right in the Emma Rackstraw avenue of attack on Glenn Loury, or critical assessment of Glenn Loury, saying, look it, man, yeah, there's some stuff going on. There's some patterns of behavior. I mean, I agree with you, but come on. Any group of people who underwent, this must be our hypothesis. This is Usmani, but it's a version of anti-essentialism. This must be our presupposition. Any group of people, it's a counterfactual, any group of people who went through exactly the same things would more or less end up in exactly the same conditions. So you can't be blaming Black people for having disorganized families, in the sense that it hasn't got anything to do with Blackness. It must have to do with history, with economic opportunity, with social structure, with so forth and so on. To which my, I'm not sure entirely adequate reply was, okay, I mean, with Kant, I made this reference earlier, I'm prepared to acknowledge that we're all situated and we're all enmeshed in all these forces, and nobody completely determines their fate. So I'm prepared to concede that. On the other hand, what I'm not prepared to concede is that history is destiny, that whatever the statistical counterfactual claim I might make, if I had taken, I don't know what, the Armenians, Chinese, and immigrant population, and they had endured exactly the same forces as African Americans had endured, we would have exactly the same cultural patterns within those respective populations. I'm rejecting that, because I think whereas the claim that there's nothing essentially distinct about Blackness as such that necessitates a poor outcome should be made, I want to stand by my principled take. I mean, it's not an empirical claim, it's a philosophical position. I'm saying
Oop, did we lose him? Or is that just me?
We lost Glenn, yes.
no, you didn't lose me, I'm back.
Okay.
Oh,
He's back.
I don't know what happened, but I'm back. And I was just saying, in the anti-essentialism posture was not an empirical claim, it was a philosophical stance. It says, I will reason about racial inequality, binding myself by this commitment. I tried to defend it by saying, it's a civic, we're one country here, we're one people as a political entity here. We're not going to parse, we're not going to cut ourselves up into these groups. I, for example, offer the analogy of what do we do with the elderly? We know their cognitive capacities decline, but we don't call them stupid. We know that Massachusetts is a net payer into the federal fisc, probably pays more taxes than it gets back benefits from the government. And Mississippi is a net recipient from the federal fisc, probably gets more from the government than it pays to the federal government in taxes. And we know there's probably differences in the average IQ of residents of Massachusetts and Mississippi. I don't know that for a fact, but I'd be willing to wager that you probably got a few points difference there. But nobody stands on the floor of the House of Representatives and says the Mississippians are not as smart as the Massachusetts residents, and therefore we should not be whatever. No one makes that argument, because it turns on a fragmentation of the polity that would be unsustainable. We don't talk to each other in that way. we're all going to be old someday. And so we forbear when we acknowledge the cognitive decline of even presidential candidates. You know, we're one union here. And even though the populations in the different geographic areas do differ in certain ways, some of those differences we won't invoke when we try to account for disparity. Likewise, I was saying that about race. And I want to stand by that while at the same time holding out the prospect that agency can have effect. So I've got two audiences in mind, Emma. I've got the public argument where I want to insist upon anti-essentialism and discipline our discourse in that way. But I've also got the communal argument where I want to exhort, in effect, I mean, they hold out as an ideal that improvements in patterns of social organization and ways of living within the community can have real effects. It doesn't seem to me that those things are inconsistent, but perhaps it seems so to you. Is Emma still there?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she's still here.
Yes.
May I ask a question? So, so first of all, I think the topics you're raising are not in the least bits off limits, especially to economists, right? And I certainly remember the bell curve debates. I remember Neal and Johnson. I've written papers about family structure and its differential effects on, or differences in family structure as being a cause of Black-white differences in developmental outcomes. But so I guess the question I want to raise with you is, I think you're letting current society off a bit too easily in assuming that, I think you're making the argument that really most of the differences has to do with the supply of skills. And, if we could just get that right, everything would be fine. But, think back on, the data. So much of Black progress, Black economic progress, occurred over the course of a few years following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1966. It was a discontinuous change. And, I think one could have, and I guess, at what moment did the sort of bias and structure or institutions become so second order that we now think it's all the behavioral inputs? Not that those aren't important, but there's nothing left of that that's holding people back. Is that really?
Well, all, nothing. I mean, I'd want to back off from the all and nothing, but
Okay.
mostly and relatively less, I would say. And I mean, I'm going to invoke the concept of diminishing returns, Professor Autor. I'm going to say low-hanging fruit are easily picked and that the apples at the top of the tree are hard to get to. I'm not sure what you had in mind. Okay, fair housing. Okay, so we got that on the books. What about fair credit? Anybody know who Ice Cube is? Ice Cube is a rapper, and he just put out, there's a controversy on Twitter and elsewhere because he put out something that the Trump administration liked, and he's willing to talk to the Trump administration. He's a Black guy. I don't want to go into all the details. Bottom line is, he's got a contract with Black America that he's trying to sell. And some of the stipulations are that banks should be required to have their loan portfolio composed in such a manner that if the local community is 32% African-American, then 32% of their loans need to be going to Black people. You could go there, I mean, there are further equal opportunity in positions that one could make, but I think at a point they start to be counterproductive. I certainly think that's one of them. I mean, I think that would be, not such a great thing to do. So I'm not sure what you had in mind in terms of enhancing the anti-discrimination regime that we're already embedded in. I made my argument about affirmative action, which is a small part of that regime. And my concern is specialized. It's about the most elite selective venues, but I'm not sure what I'm missing. What am I missing that we should be doing that we're not doing?
I think it's a fair question. I mean, I do think it's hard to say what is the specific body of law where, or civil of institutions where discrimination overtly survives or even covertly. I mean, I think certainly in the quality of schools, right? Like, so I think our school system is the one that most disparately serves adversely serves poor communities, Black communities. I actually think that the liberal prejudice against charter schools is incredibly destructive. So that's one. So I'm not sure. I know, Glenn. I wish I could invoke. I wish there was the Civil Rights Act of 2021 that I knew to pass that would resolve these. But I guess yeah. So my argument, and I'm going to stop, is that it's hard for me to believe that we went from having a lot of discrimination in our institutions to having next to none, such that it's not really an important factor in what we see around us today. If everybody just got into line.
Well, we know from the resume studies, right? I mean, we know from the audit studies, although Jim Heckman is fond of making the point that you're measuring the average person, but the price is set by the marginal person. So, you know, he doesn't know if we're really measuring the amount of effective discrimination when we look at audit studies and stuff like that. I think that's a point that has to be taken seriously. But of course, there's still discrimination, and you know, there's probably always going to be discrimination. I wouldn't suggest repealing any of these statutes. I want the Federal Reserve banks to continue to gather data about lending practices and to continue to try to assess whether or not banks are vetting loan applications without regard to racial identity. I mean, I think some of the stuff is like ban the box. So this is, you know, as you know, regulating information about workers' criminal histories. And I think it's complicated. I mean, people are looking at it, you know, you could easily see theoretically how it could backfire if you prevented employers from using that kind of information about individuals. Then they're going to make inferences based on population averages, which are, you know, perhaps adverse to Blacks and things like that.
Can I ask, I mean, just on that context, building on actually what Emma asked, which I thought was excellent. But I took Emma's question to be slightly different than the one you answered, Glenn, which is not that every single community 100 million times that was subject to the same history as the Black community would end up in exactly the same place, but that we could not understand where the Black community is today, nor the mechanism via which it self-replicates without that history. The second is a weaker claim, but it brings to the same place the debate, which is that we need to pay attention to that debate, to that history, sorry, when we think of various interventions. And that because history has brought us to this place through some set of feedback loops, we cannot break where we are without those feedback loops. So in particular, for example, we can't break the problems of the Black community vis-a-vis the family without also solving the majority's law enforcement approach, which goes back to convict labor and obviously the redemption era, and then the other sort of penal approach to any type of law infringement. And also affirmative action would fit into that. So let me give you the affirmative action argument, which is related but distinct, which is that if in fact the way that this is self-replicating is through role models and through the image that both the majority and the minority has, of course, what happens at the top is very important. And by the argument that you made exactly, the top is very distinct, is very competitive. Think of it as the tail, right tail of an either relatively thick tail distribution, then even a small amount of discrimination or disadvantage for a community means that they're going to be very highly absent from the tail. Think of shifting a normal distribution a little bit to the left, and you're not going to see any Black people at the very, very, very right tail because of that discrimination. But then if the tail, if being represented in boardrooms, if being represented in the best academic institutions, in the best intellectual areas is very important for the self-replication of the discrimination against Blacks, then affirmative action must have a central role in breaking that cycle. And that, again, I think builds on what Emma said.
I think let's just on the affirmative action point that there's a trade-off in that whereas the demonstration effect or the role model effect that you're calling attention to could be operative, these are empirical questions, but let me stipulate that there's something to that. There's also the question of whether, that I try to call attention to, or whether or not the difference in performance amongst those selected continues to present itself if you've got difference in the criteria coming in and you use affirmative action. And that's going to be a negative in the effort to try to get equality. I mean, you're going to get, I was a little bit cautious in how I said it, but you're going to get patronization. This is the point of this paper I have with Stephen Coate in 1993. It's a long time ago, but the basic argument is you have affirmative action, people take the incentives into account. There's an equilibrium where the institution thinks it has to use a lower standard to get representation, but where the fact of the lower standard undercuts incentives to invest in skill, which requires then you have to use a lower standard to get representation. That's an equilibrium. And that's a little
It's a fantastic paper, and we teach it, Glenn. So
oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
Yes,
that's
it's
very,
a fantastic
very
paper.
Okay, thank you, Vic. I wasn't fishing for a compliment, but I'll take it. But you see what I'm saying? I'm saying that this is about affirmative action. I want to come to the other point because I think that's very important. I'm just saying that there's a downside as well as the benefit, and it's the downside that I'm beginning to worry about as I see the preference regime being institutionalized. So, for example, in New York City with these exam schools, the talk now, I don't think it will succeed politically, but de Blasio and company have been talking about getting rid of the selective, the very intense examination regimen that students go through to be selected. And I worry that the consequence of that might end up being a two-tier post-reform circumstance where there's the real thing that's going on in the classroom with the kids who are, you know, quite literally way out in the right tail of human development. I'm not saying it's intrinsic or genetically determined. I'm not saying it's based on their race, but I'm just saying the fact is that when they present themselves, they're at very different positions in terms of their mastery over particular kinds of intellectual work. And I might be prepared to live with a little bit less role model and a little bit more equality in the criteria that are used for selection, because I think the dignity, the kind of honor that you get from succeeding at the task is endogenous. And if it's common knowledge that the criteria for selection have been compromised in order to include people like you, then the ability for anyone like you to be able to garner for yourself the reputational benefit from that success will be undermined. I mean, if Nobel Prizes were being handed out based on political influence, there haven't been any Turks. We need someone of Turkish extraction. That would diminish the value of the prize, wouldn't it? I mean, you see what I'm getting at?
Just wait a few more years and we'll have a Turkish Nobel Prize winner, Glenn.
On the other question, though, I want to emphasize, because I'm being corrected here by Emma and Daron, and I accept the correction. What to do should be the paramount question. What to do should be the paramount question, regardless of the relative apportionment of importance to bias versus developmental activities. That could be one thing. It could be 70-30, it could be 30-70. It doesn't necessarily tell us what to do. And if indeed structure is important, even if it's only 30%, the thing that we can do to make a difference might depend almost entirely on that 30%. So it's a non sequitur to conclude policy is impotent from observing that supply side matters. And I accept that as a friendly amendment to my argument. Okay, you guys, anything else?
Jeremy, I think your hand is up. Why don't you go next?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess just bouncing off of that, you know, you mentioned family structure, for example, being one of the key issues here. Are there policies that you think are likely to lower the rate of out-of-wedlock births?
I mean, anything I say here is going to be a platitude. I mean, the correct answer is I don't know. I mean, here are what people have said. Bill Wilson, the William Julius Wilson, the sociologist at Harvard, has said that the high rate of out-of-wedlock births is associated with the low marriageability of Black men because so many are in prison and so many have don't have strong economic profiles, and hence are not attractive mates. And therefore, if there were greater employment opportunities, and one could talk about how to get them at decent wages for workers, there would be more stable family life amongst the so-called marriageable pool hypothesis. And that's one kind of argument. Another kind of argument over the years has been that the incentive effects of social transfer programs are such that the private decisions that men and women are making about commitment in marriage in the context of childbearing are affected by the outside options and alternative opportunities that public assistance creates, and that incentive effect is implicated in the disparities, and one should be worried about that in the design of social transfer programs. I mean, I don't regard either of those kinds of speculation. There's, I imagine, others that one could envision. I don't personally regard either of those speculations as empirically so slam dunk compelling that I would want to try to build policy around them. I certainly wouldn't want to redesign any further the temporary assistance to needy families program out of a concern about the composition of Black families, or American families for that matter. This was a part of the welfare reform debate back in the 90s, as I recall. I would argue that the issues about employment should compel our attention, to be sure, but they should, for the sake of decent social policy altogether, not with particular regard to impact on family structure. So I'm taking a long time to say, I don't know.
Are there any policies that you do recommend?
What policies do I recommend? Okay, yeah. I mean, but I told you what I was against. I was against elite affirmative action that used different standards for selecting Blacks and other people. And I was against reparations in the broadly gauged sense of America repaying a debt to Black people for the reasons that I adduced. I didn't say I was for, but I am for expanded access to healthcare for the modestly economically situated people in the country. I am for, here's what I would say about educational opportunity. I think David mentioned this. I would say, so one principle of equality and provision of educational services is the one that governs now, which is equal expenditure per pupil, where the different local districts differ in the value of real estate and hence in their tax bases, and so are not equally situated for spending on kids' education. And then the state can, through its revenue transfer programs, redistribute resources amongst districts so as to equalize expenditures per pupil, and that's the principle. But one could think about a different principle, and I speculate that a case can be made for a principle of something like equal effective educational opportunity, where the goal is to acknowledge that different districts are differently placed with respect to the social conditions of the students there. And a district with disadvantaged students, more special education, more problems of kid behavior in the classroom, less resources at home, economic disadvantage, food insecurity, things like that. Maybe you want to spend more per pupil, with the goal being to try to equalize the effective educational opportunity of the students. That would be a very different kind of equality principle to bring into the educational sphere. I think the war on drugs was a mistake. I mean, this is very easy to say in retrospect. I think pretty much everybody can see that now. We're over incarcerated, our sentences are too long, and so forth and so on. I spent some time years ago trying to educate myself about this, and did some collaborative work with, Bruce Western. I hear you had Bruce Western as one of your, Bruce and I have done a couple of things together on the incarceration. He's coming?
Yeah, he's a few weeks from now.
Yeah, Bruce is a friend and a colleague and someone I've collaborated with at the American Academy and at National Research Council and whatnot on decarceration type policies and being mindful of the racial disparity in incarceration rates. And I think a lot could be said about policing. Of course, that's the topic du jour, but accountability of police officers and so forth. A lot could be said. I'm not an expert in these areas of criminology or whatnot, but I would look to the quality of the general social safety net. I mean, I take this as a principle, which is to say, I don't think there's any justification for worrying about educational opportunity for African Americans as such. One worries about educational opportunity for Americans to the extent that African Americans are disproportionate among those ill-served by educational opportunity, then so much the better in terms of reducing racial inequality. But it feels like the tail wagging the dog to me to make social policy in a country of 330 million people on the basis of an effort to rectify the historically inherited racial disparity that is affecting, I don't know, a quarter to a third of the African-American population. Mind you now, we're not talking about every person of African descent in the country being somehow fundamentally disadvantaged purely because of the color of their skin. We're talking about people living in enclaves in urban areas who have the particular socioeconomic profiles that they have. Still, we're talking 10 million people, 15 million people, if you want to be generous in the estimate. That's a lot of people. But I would argue, and I'd argue this not only from a kind of targeting argument where I would say, you want to go generic because your political coalition is going to be more robust. I'd also argue it from a moral perspective. I think the right theory of social choice, the right theory of social justice is one in which the particular demographic, individual idiosyncratic demographic characteristics of a person should not have any bearing on the weight to which the weight that the social decision maker gives to that person's welfare. A kind of transracial humanism is the right philosophical stance. That does not mean colorblind action. Arguments that I'm sure a dozen people on this call could fashion effortlessly would refute the claim that it follows from equal weighing of individuals regardless of race that we have to be colorblind. I don't believe that that's true. But I think in terms of formulating social policy, I think mainly in terms of what's good for the society regarding healthcare and housing provision and things of this kind.
I have one more for you, if others aren't going to ask. So, when we talk about the problems of African Americans in the U.S., well, I guess that follows. Really, it's African American men, much more than African American women, right? In the labor market, in terms of intergenerational mobility, there's so and if you look at the descriptive work by Raj Chetty, it seems the intergenerational mobility rate of African American women is the same as white women, as high as white men as well. Do you have any thoughts on kind of that particular, challenge?
Well, other than to say that it's a huge part of the landscape and needs to be taken on board seriously, I don't. I mean, I'm going to confess ignorance here, but I won't be alone. I'm not alone in the puzzle about gender disparity amongst African Americans. I think 2 and 3 college goers, something very close to that amongst Blacks, are women. I think if you look at the impact of incarceration, I mean, it's largely a male story, although there are, Black women in prison to be sure, but it's largely a male story. And I'm going to want to read developmental psychologists and whatnot to try to get some handle on the gender thing. And I'm not as sufficiently well informed that I feel like I could respond effectively to that, other than to say, yes, you put your finger on something that's obviously important.
Okay, well, I mean, I think this has been terrific, Glenn. I mean, I think it's really this is thought-provoking, inspirational, and really engaging simultaneously. So it's really a privilege to have you here.
David,
well, that's very kind of you to say, David. It's really, as I say, I was honored by the invitation and happy to, throw my stuff out there for your critical consideration. I'm intending to be a provocateur. And I just want to reiterate, my education at MIT has served me very well, because even though, it was very intense. I mean, it was theory, it was econometrics, it was It was quantitative, it was rigorous, it was scientific. The spirit of the department has always, in my mind, embodied a sense of public service and obligation. Peter Diamond's interest in social insurance, Bob's interest in employment and work, Jonathan Gruber on health. I mean, we could go on in this vein. So I got to start in the right place, and I'm proud to be an alumnus. So thank you.
All right, fabulous. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us, Glenn. This is invaluable. And if you want to come to
and congratulations on Isaiah
Andrews. Yeah,
Andrews. Yeah, I mean that's also to you all get some credit for that indirectly, don't you?
We'll take some.
Yeah.
Thank you, Glenn.
Bye now, everyone.
This was great. Thanks for coming and spending the time with us and staying for the discussion and answering all the questions and engaging in the debate. It was fantastic.
I learned something from you guys.
And I think I like where you ended up with, which is that we really need to do more social science, which is case by case. It's not like the general philosophy bias versus that, but it's like case by case, which policies work, understanding with the historical feedback mechanisms that have brought us here. So I think that's a good place to end.
I got there with some help from you and Emma.
No. Emma gets the credit. Thanks very much, Glenn. That was fantastic.
Bye-bye.